What are some of the bodybuilding techniques that we should be adopting to begin to have a more healthy body composition for the average gym goer?
The big one is training hard. Not how much you need to train, not how often you need to train, but really putting forth the kind of effort that you might see if you were to watch a pumping iron, or if you were to watch some of the videos of even current bodybuilders. You will see that whatever implement they're lifting, whether it's a selectorized machine, a barbell, a dumbbell, or their body weight, it moves a lot slower at the end of their sets than the beginning. And that is because they're reaching true momentary muscular failure or somewhere close to it within, 3, 4 reps, 2 reps, 1 rep.
How do people like us with a drive to excel and a belief in our own agency navigate life's complexities? How do we sift through the vast sea of knowledge to find actionable insights in areas like habits, health, wealth, and relationships? Come with me as I interview intellectuals and all-stars to refine life's ungoogleable lessons. I save you time and effort by finding the best of life's messy questions in this podcast to give you the answers. My name is Blake Bottrell, and this is the Distilled Podcast. My guest today is an imported Kiwi who often gets mistaken for Captain America. With a job title of Chief Science Officer of 3DMJ, it sounds like he should be closer to the captain of the Starship Enterprise. A bodybuilder for almost 2 decades and a doctor or research fellow at the Auckland University of Technology for 1, his work brings exercise science to anyone looking to build a world-class physique. Dr. Helms, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's a huge privilege and pleasure. Thank you for the warm introduction. I really appreciate the kind words, man.
So, who's Quelly and why is he important to your fitness journey?
Yeah. So Quelly is the contest prep, or I should say bodybuilding.com forums username that I had when I first got into my fitness journey, like you aptly described. And this is circa 2004 when I started lifting. And it was coming right off the end of me being heavily involved on the bboys.com and rapmusic.com forums. So for those who don't know, first, before there was social media, the way that people communicated in corners of the internet to find a like-minded community was before Facebook groups, before Instagram channels, before YouTube channels. Actually, right around the same time as YouTube first starting up, there were forums. And as a young man, I was heavily into hip hop, like underground hip hop. I started as a breakdancer in high school, and then I actually got into emceeing or like lyrically focused hip hop for a while. And one of the places that we all congregated was bboys.com, another one rapmusic.com, and we actually had either text-based typed battles, like you'll see like battle rap battle leagues these days, or even recorded battles where you'd make basically a diss track versus the other person, and you'd see who you'd get more votes, and eventually, you moved up in the ranks, et cetera, et cetera. And I had a whole arc of my young life where I was really, really involved in that, just as obsessed as I was with bodybuilding today as I was then. So my first thought when I wanted to create a little more of a community and see what other people were doing and share ideas was to get on the bodybuilding forums, just like I was on the B-Boys forums. And my rap name was Quelly. So I just kind of took a version of that, Quelly, as my username on the bodybuilding.com forums.
If you had to point to 2 to 3 landmark pieces of fitness and nutrition research in the last 20 years, what would they be?
That's a great question. The last 20 years? I think there's a paper by Hubel and colleagues in 2005. So it's just kind of on the cusp of that 20-year mark. That was a really interesting multi-site data collection that was done across multiple hospital sites with multiple research groups together. Typically something you normally only will see in medical research. In sports science and exercise science, we don't have the resources or the funding to do this type of thing. But Hubel and colleagues led an investigation of nearly 600 adults, a roughly even split between men and women, and had these untrained people perform 12 weeks of bicep curl training. And they measured via MRI, very high standard, very valid and highly reliable assessment of cross-sectional area, their bicep thickness at the start and finish, and also changes in their performance, most notably, I think, to a relevant kind of fitness audience, their 1RM bicep curl strength. And the paradigm that you see in most medical research, which is kind of where exercise science research was born, is that we're describing population norms, we're understanding typical responses, and it is largely trying to inform kind of quote unquote public health advice or generalized recommendations for a class of athlete or a fitness content consumer. Now that's changing, but definitely was the case 20 years ago. That was the primary focus. And this was the first time, or at least the first well-publicized time, that not just reporting the means, which are the average, and the standard deviation, which describes how much variation within individuals there is around that mean, they reported ranges. So that is two numbers, the smallest number and the highest number across this 600 people. And there were changes in muscle size, cross-sectional area, between -2% to +59%, meaning that some person out there signed up for a study, untrained, never having lifted before, and basically had no detectable change, or maybe even a slight decrease in the size of their biceps after doing bicep curls regularly. Sad day. And someone else realized maybe I missed out on a career to become Mr. or Miss Olympia because my bicep size increased damn near 60% from 12 weeks of bicep curl training. And similarly, for 1RM strength, there were changes from 0% to plus 250% increases, which is like a 10 kilogram increase in your bicep curl, which is like 22, 23 pounds. So this study is incredibly important because it is one of the first insights we have into just how bad of an idea it is to follow cookie cutter based programs or to make these broad sweeping generalizations in fitness, and why we see so many people doing vastly different things and seemingly still succeeding. So that's probably the first one that I'd bring up, Blake. And I don't know if you want to go down that rabbit hole or if you want me to bring up a second one or not.
No, keep going. There's definitely some follow-up questions, but we'll get to those afterwards for sure.
Okay. So another one, I'll go with something that is just outside of the 20-year mark. I think it was 2002, but I sometimes forget the year it was published, by Wing and Jeffrey. And this is one of those cool scientific discoveries where you intend to do one thing and you find another. And your hypothesis, not only do you find out is wrong, but the question itself was misguided. So what Wing and Jeffrey wanted to do in the early 2000s is they were specifically curious about the problem people really face in weight loss research is not their ability to lose weight in the first instance, but why is there such high recidivism? Why do most people regain the weight they've lost? So what they wanted to do was to experimentally introduce diet breaks, or not the way we think of it in the modern era of a diet break as an experimental tool, but a break in the diet. Because that, they figured, and they hypothesized quite correctly, is that's the problem. If we can figure out why people break their diet, maybe we can do something to intervene around that. So what they took was these three groups in an outpatient design who were going to something akin to Weight Watchers. It was a group-based diet setting where they'd go in, they'd weigh in, they'd talk about their nutrition, they'd get group support around their purposeful phase of trying to intentionally induce weight loss on their own. It wasn't a specific protocol. They weren't inpatient. It wasn't, like an intervention study in that tightly controlled manner. But they had these three groups. One group took a 6-week break from going to these meetings in the middle of this 24-week observed period. Another group took a few different 3-week breaks, and then one group just kept going continuously. And they hypothesized that the groups that took the purposeful 6-week break and the 2 3-week breaks, or it was either 3 2-week breaks, I can't remember which, but smaller breaks or longer break or no break, it would mess them up. It would be an interruption to their goal attainment, and they would experience recidivism, start regaining their weight. And they found quite the opposite, that actually they ended up getting to the same point as the group that continuously dieted despite taking these diet breaks. And so the idea here is that somehow they're getting some kind of enhancement of the period where they are dieting. Maybe a ability to take a psychological break, come back, and then stick with it, to where they gained basically an efficiency advantage over the group that tried to do it continuously. And this might be demonstrating some type of diet fatigue. But what's really important about this study is it shows that it is your loss of control that specifically degrades self-efficacy and potentially leads to weight cycling. And the problem that is going on is not the simple act of stopping. It's the act of stopping when it is not your intention to do so. And this speaks to human motivation around being autonomous, competent, self-determination theory. That when you're purposely going, right, I'm going to stop this diet, not waiting until the proverbial wheels have fallen off, it's not hard to start back up versus dieting until you actually slip up or some type of social event throws you off and you feel guilt and shame and all those things that become secondary barriers that compound. So I think these two pieces of research are really interesting. One shows us that we're very different as individuals, even though resistance training is great for everybody. We shouldn't expect the same results, and therefore we probably shouldn't take the same approach. And two, that while the physiology is really, really interesting behind metabolism, fat loss, adaptation, we have to really respect ourselves as humans and not machines, and that we're not just a collection of complex physiological interactions, but we are also our thoughts, our feelings, and our rationalizations, and that leveraging psychology is just as, if not more important than physiology.
I think that sort of begs the follow-up question of when is it then important to look at meta-analyses, and when is it important to focus on the N of 1 experiment?
Great question. Yeah, so for those who don't know, meta-analysis is a really useful and important technique that we have in exercise science and sports nutrition specifically, where we have less funding, typically don't have these studies like I described by Hubel, and we're making inference based upon groups of 10 to 20 in each group. That does pose the risk of us having a unrepresentative sample or having type 1 or type 2 errors and effects being significant when they otherwise wouldn't be if we had different sampling, or the opposite. So a meta-analysis collects enough similarly like studies, and if done well, can enhance statistical power and give us a similar but not quite as good outcome as, say, that 600-person study. A 600-person meta-analysis that has more heterogeneity in design, research questions, inclusion criteria, measurements than that same study with the same methods, but it is about as close as we can get in exercise science. So that data is great for helping us understand typical responses. And certainly, say, a meta-analysis on the relationship between proximity to failure and hypertrophy, or volume and hypertrophy, or a certain threshold of protein intake and adaptations to training. It's great for me giving you generalized guidelines or updating a textbook, or if you come to me and you don't have careful notes or much experience, and I want to get you in the right ballpark, that's the first way that that type of data is really helpful. I can get you in a place where I think you're probably going to have a positive response, and based upon typical normally distributed data, where we think one standard deviation from the mean describes about 2/3 of people, we can go right. Odds are, if I'm going to go to Vegas, if I want to bet on black or bet on red, or maybe a little bit of money on black and most of my money on red, I'm going to start you in this volume range with these types of loads, this proximity to failure, this frequency, and these types of guidance for macronutrients. Modern sports science, like you described, N of 1, and I like the way you're framing that because it still indicates we're using research, and we can and we are, is starting to ask different questions. It's not that there isn't value, nor that we'll stop doing these group-based designs, looking for statistical significance, reporting confidence intervals, and getting an idea of how things generally work for most people. But some of the frontiers that we're trying to approach require different questions and different statistical designs. So, for example, one of my students who I'm working with at the Florida Atlantic University, Zach Robinson, he's using a design called a within-subject crossover with repeated measures. A within-subject design, or within-participant design, is when you serve as your own control in real time, meaning your left leg and your right leg, or your left arm and your right arm, are randomized to two different protocols. So we can compare a hypertrophy program of two different types in, say, your quadricep, high reps versus low reps, more frequency versus less frequency, etc., that type of thing. A warm-up versus no warm-up, maybe. And there are limitations to this design. There is something called the cross-education effect, which muddies the waters for performance. Because if you train your right limb, you learn from that on your left limb and vice versa. So strength adaptations can carry over. Even if you don't train your left limb at all, and you do right arm bicep curls, your left arm bicep curl will increase. But for the local muscular adaptation of, say, hypertrophy, it's actually a fantastic design if we want to uncover what's going to actually make tissue adapt, because there doesn't seem to be kind of any morphological crossover effect. So anyway, that cross-education effect, notable confounder, but not for certain outcomes like tissue adaptation. So you've got your left and your right leg doing different protocols. Why is that powerful? Because now you are an N of 2, not just an N of 1. And also you're a perfectly controlled N of 1 because both of those limbs are connected to the same digestive tract and brain. So the sleep the nutrition, the genetics, everything is perfectly controlled. So the statistical power is better than if we had Joe and Jim both doing both their legs on these two different protocols. So that is one thing. Additionally, we can use what's called a crossover design. And this is where you do one protocol, we do a washout period to negate the effects or wash out the effects of whatever that first protocol was, and then bring you back in and do the other. Similar advantages, but now we're not your own control in real time. There's potentially different nutrition, different sleep, different life stressors, different ambient temperature in the room because it's a different season now if it's a semester later, whatever. And both of those can be combined even further for us to get an idea of what the variance is in your individual response. So if we just did the within subject design, we can't know for sure that there isn't some random variation that's going on in your left or right limb or you overall that might be describing the difference between those limbs. So you'd need to actually do a within participant design and do a crossover so that the legs swapped and then actually repeat it again. So it's quite the time burden. But when you do that, then you can actually quantify your individual variation, the random response that we can't explain to a given in both programs, but then do it again to see, okay, the difference or an adaptation between limbs within that person beyond that random variance, that is the true individual response. So it's complex. There's a lot of assumptions. It is a higher burden on both the participant and the researcher, but that's the type of thing where we can potentially start to answer some of these questions. And there's other statistical techniques we have where we are trying to quantify a reasonable estimate of individual variation in response, and then use that as a benchmark to say, okay, any response greater than that is a true difference in the individual. Now, for all the coaches out there or the people who are just going, Eric, Jesus, I just want to get bigger biceps. Personally, I'm not in an exercise science lab. You do have to chase individual response. And I would encourage you, even though you're not getting an IRB, you're not recruiting participants, you don't have an MRI machine, to take some of the same philosophies of science, like observation and control, and apply them to yourself. If you're interested in trying a new supplement, if you're interested in trying a new program, if you're interested in trying to manipulate your sleep for the better, it does make sense to do the shotgun approach and do all of these theoretically better things simultaneously to get the most gains possible. But when you're doing things that you're not sure if they're going to work, or if you're not sure if you're going to respond in the typical way that most people do, it would behoove you to introduce those things one at a time while keeping other things relatively constant so you can see if that stone you unturned had a positive effect in a controlled environment. And then maybe even try it twice. And that's what a good coach does. Instead of just changing everything, they'll change one thing at a time to try to see if that is potentially something that'll be useful for them, especially when they're coloring outside of the lines and they're going, you know what, I don't think you are within 1 or even 2 standard deviations of the typical response. We might need a relatively unique approach, very low volume, very high volume. I actually think you need higher protein, lower protein, or whatever.
That's great. I think the experimentation in the fitness industry has a lot of room for growth. That sounds like an obvious statement, but I sort of loop that in with the sorely underserved idea right now of preventative medicine. What do you think, in your opinion, would have to change for the funding amounts to start to increase as part of a sort of push for preventative medicine in Gen Pop?
I think we would need to see more uptake and willingness. The biggest problem for, say, insurance providers or medical systems or some of this stuff is that public health campaigns are not very great at getting uptake. Like one of the talking head messages you'll sometimes get from people who are critical of, say, a moderate or high carb approach to nutrition, and they're maybe advocating for a low carb approach, is look at these public health guidelines. They say, 65% of your calories should come from carbohydrates. People are unhealthier than ever. See, these guidelines are killing us. We shouldn't trust the establishment. We should try these different nutritional approaches. The funny thing, though, is that people are not hitting the guidelines. If you actually see what proportion of people are meeting the USDA or UK or Australian or New Zealand, recommendations for nutrition, and then even more so for activity levels, it is a minority by a long shot of the population actually hitting them. So while preventative medicine looks great on paper, and it is true that most of the time exercise and nutrition interventions, if they were followed per protocol, would be better than many of the typical drug treatments that we have for some of these ill health outcomes like cardiovascular disease or metabolic disease. That doesn't necessarily mean that we can have a reliable assumption that people are going to do it. People will take a pill every day, but it's very challenging for people to consistently and long-term, for likely their life, if they have a lifestyle disease, if you will, adopt these health and nutrition behaviors and physical activity guidelines in such a way that's going to consistently reduce their likelihood of early death or reduce their health span. And this is not my area. I'm not a public health guy, but I would say that the more we can change messaging or modify interventions so that the adherence rates and the uptake rates are higher, the more we can prove that, hey, there's worthwhile putting money into this because it'll actually be done. But as long as the uptake rates and adherence rates are poor, it's going to be looked at as a poor investment from the powers that be.
That's a totally fair assessment. I'd never actually thought about it as a people problem versus a process problem. So that makes total sense to me. And yeah, I think I put in a newsletter, this was 2 years ago almost now, but like 1/3 of adults over 50 do not consume the minimum recommended daily amount of protein. And that recommended daily minimum amount of protein is likely half of what it should actually be for most people to actually not lose muscle mass in the late stages of their life. So people problem. Got it.
Absolutely.
I've heard you talk about some bodybuilding techniques being almost antithetical to the ways that someone would have a good recreational healthy body composition. What are some of the bodybuilding techniques that we should be adopting to begin to have a more healthy body composition for the average gym goer?
The big one is training hard. Not how much you need to train, not how often you need to train, but really putting forth the kind of effort that you might see if you were to watch a pumping iron, or if you were to watch some of the videos of even, current bodybuilders train. You will see that whatever implement they're lifting, whether it's a selectorized machine, a barbell, a dumbbell, or their body weight, it moves a lot slower at the end of their sets than the beginning. And that is because they're reaching true momentary muscular failure or somewhere close to it within, 3-4 reps, 2 reps, 1 rep. The reason why that's so important is because while, yes, if you do that and you train with a high volume and you do all these nutrition things perfectly and you do it for 10 years, you can develop an amazing physique. But if you don't have great genetics, if you only have 2 hours per week to train, if you don't have the time to do high volume, if you don't like being in the gym for hours on end, but you want to get a potent effect, that is the tool that remains on the table. You're going to be there anyway, and you're only going to be there 2 hours per week, then you need to milk out everything of that training session that you can. So there's a lot of data indicating that high volume training is beneficial, but I think people sometimes start with what is theoretically optimal on paper, not what are my constraints, and then how do I optimize within those constraints. And that's one area where regardless of the amount of work you're doing, you can make it far more effective. And the first set you do in a series of sets is actually the most important because it is giving you the quote unquote most bang for your buck. So while bodybuilders are very interested in any return on investment, the average person is interested in the highest ROI. So if you want to know what's the amount of volume and the amount of work that I can do to maximally benefit from the smallest time investment, now you're looking at something like I'm going to train 2 hours per week across 2 to 3 days. I'm doing 4 to 8 sets per muscle group, and I'm training to failure. And I'm probably going to get 2/3 to 3/4 of the gains I could possibly get, believe it or not, especially in that early newbie stage where you make all the gains that you need for health and the majority of your gains that will make an aesthetic difference. And you can let the bodybuilders worry about getting the other 20 to 30% of their genetic potential because they're literally competing in it. And those small differences make a big difference visually and in terms of what we see as on average. It's very much like sprinting. If you have a 10-second 100-meter sprint, I'd say you're a national caliber Olympic hopeful. But you shave that down by 10%, you're going to the trials. You shave it down by another 10%, you're in the Olympics. Shave it down by another 10%, you're potentially on the podium, even though those are literally 0.1 second differences in the time that someone is running. But there's many.
can we find a sweet spot between this low frequency, high intensity newbie gains period with the psychological benefit of habit formation that comes from being in the gym a lot of days per week when someone's still starting to develop that habit?
Yeah. One thing you don't want to do is take a minimum dose approach when someone has the time and the psychological passionate drive to do more. I absolutely do think you want to facilitate as a trainer or yourself, for yourself, the willingness you have right now to put in the effort time. But you don't want to conflate that with trying to do everything all at once all the time when you're perhaps not ready and you're trying to learn multiple skills. Basically, the question is sustainable? And that's a question that as a trainer you have to ask. I mean, literally ask your clients and ask them to think about it. Or for yourself, if you know you tend to be an all or nothing jump in kind of person, assess yourself realistically. Like, how many things have you gone all in on and jumped into that you wanted to do for the long term that you don't do anymore? And then ask yourself, why didn't that work? Often some aspect of it is that maybe all in was more than you actually could reasonably do while maintaining other aspects of who you are in the life you wanted to live. So it's the process of really trying to determine, what will I stick with? I know I'm motivated to do it all right now, but am I going to actually go to the gym twice per day after the summer semester is over, or after my kids are out of school and they're home, or during the phase when sales are really high at my job, or when I'm traveling, or insert your life circumstance here and go, the worst case scenario of how busy and stressful my life gets, could I sustain this? And if there's even a question like, 50-50, it's too much, or it's too much all at once. Because the way that we build habits, it's by graded exposure. We start with something, we get a win on the board, and it changes our identity a little bit. We go from being, I'm someone who's starting this new exercise journey, and I'm really excited about what I can do, to I'm someone who exercises. And then it goes from that to, I'm the person in the gym that people ask questions about. And then it goes to, I'm the forum moderator on bodybuilding.com forums if it was 20 years ago. You start to have an identity as not only just a member of a community or someone participating in activity, but a leader, a respected individual, someone who wakes up and makes different decisions than they used to and has pride in that identity and a sense of community. You have self-determination theory, autonomy, competence, and relatedness through this new activity. Once you have that, good news, you're probably, at least to some degree, going to be a lifer. And that is the point when you start stacking more chips and you keep basically chasing the next level. But you really have to make sure that you're not standing on sand, that you're actually standing on a firm foundation of behavior change before you start adopting a ton more.
So when we're working in this newbie period that's been well established now as a fast gains period, and someone is looking to get in there and they're maybe not totally fresh, but they don't know exactly what they're doing. And they're like, I know I'm supposed to be working on progressive overload, and I know I'm supposed to be working on just continuing to move forward, whether it's additional reps, more weight, all that sort of stuff. How do we look at the relationship between form, weight, and time under tension? Because I think a lot of people in this newbie phase oftentimes will try to maybe push weight over their skis, and then their form degrades, and then they get injured. So how should we think about moving through this and making sure we're not getting too far ahead of ourselves at the start?
I think a really useful way of framing it is inverting the concept of progressive overload, not as something you must do to result in adaptations, but the fact that you can progress as an indication that overload has occurred. And this also helps you have a more process-oriented focus. And process-oriented people tend to achieve their goals better. And we actually have empirical data on that. The more time you spend ruminating, especially during the activity, on what you're going to extract or get out of it eventually, it's kind of like looking at the top of Everest and not realizing that, climb starts with a single step, and focusing on the steps and enjoying the process and looking how the view changes and going, wow, look what this body can do. I can climb this mountain. So inverting progressive overload to thinking of overload resulting in progression is focusing on the process of overload. I'm in the gym right now, today, and my job is to use good technique whatever that is, depending on the context of what we're talking about, and exert a high level of effort on every single one of those reps in trying to work as hard as I can right now, given whatever my fatigue state is, my motivation, how distracted I am, how much sleep I got, did I skip a meal or not? Am I training at 8 p.m. instead of 2 p.m. because of my schedule? Hey, I'm in here. Let's do the best I can. And knowing that if you continually do that and you stack those chips, you're going to notice, oh shit, I'm on the next stack down on the selectorized equipment, or I have to slap some 25s on top of that 45. And that is the result of sufficient overload. That also gives you the opportunity to use it as a diagnosis. Instead of going, I must put 5 pounds on the bar to get progressive overload so I can keep growing, which is almost like a fear-based, outcome-focused response. And then, like you said, degrading form, or maybe even risking something. You're going, right, I've been putting in the work. Does it result in me being able to put more on the bar? And that'll happen when it happens. And if that does happen, that means the overload is sufficient. However, if I have been putting in the work and that's not happening, now that's an indication that I need to kind of go back to the drawing board and look at what aspects of either my lifestyle outside of the gym, nutrition, sleep, recovery, stress levels, etc., or what I'm doing in the gym need to change. We're getting back to that place where the overload is sufficient and I'm recovering from it so that I get to add weight to the bar.
That's like a totally new framing for me. I'd never thought about progressive overload as an outcome and not a process. Is there anything else in the fitness world that you think people wouldn't intuitively understand, or is there anywhere else where people confuse processes and outcomes on a regular basis?
I think generally the concept of SMART goals, which are really, really popular, are often creating more problems than they're worth. And there's actually some data to back this up. Everyone thinks like goal setting is a really important piece of success, and that's 100% true. However, when they then default to SMART goals, which somehow invaded the fitness space in the 90s, they don't actually know the history of where SMART goals came from. So SMART goals are actually a management tool that come from the corporate sales world. And sometimes you'll notice that the SMART acronym has changed a lot. So A is sometimes actionable and R is sometimes realistic. And you're like, what's the difference between those two? I'm not sure. The reason being is the original SMART goal, A stood for assignable, because it was literally you're assigning sales targets to people. And the reason why that's not a great fit for fitness is because SMART goals really tend to have you focusing on outcomes, not processes, because of what they're asking. Like if they're time restricted, if they're measurable, and sure, it's true, the old adage, what's measured gets managed. But when you don't actually have that tight of control over how much weight you put on the bar on a week-to-week basis, you don't know your genetics, right? You don't know your recovery status. What if you're dealing with someone who's dealing with chronic pain? You know, all these reasons of why maybe it's more important to focus on the process and the outcome, going back to the research I stated. It's much better to have someone who is looking for a lifestyle change that's going to result in better metabolic health and hopefully maybe a fair amount of weight loss along the way, to be focused on regularly eating fruits and vegetables on a day-to-day basis, not necessarily did I drop a pound this week, right? If you don't drop a pound this week, which could be for many reasons, and you might drop it next week, you feel like a failure. You didn't reach your SMART goal target. However, if you ate the fruits, ate the vegetables, increased your fluid intake, got your sleep, got your cardio in, did your training, managed your stress, did your gratitude journaling, and you attended, the education seminar your trainer puts on, you did every tick box, that's a lot of wins to stack up and a lot of more steps towards that identity of I'm a person who does X, which like I talked about before is going to result in those positive outcomes. So I think one of the things that we pay lip service to is process-oriented goals and goal setting. And then we go actually against what the motivation research and the goal setting research suggests, and we try something like SMART goals. A very real outcome that is present with me as I think about this is when we tried to have a race between me and the other 3DMJ coaches to a 500-pound squat. And I needed hip surgery, Jeff tore his calf, and Brad never got there. And then eventually, 4 years later, Berto hit it, and then 5 years later, I hit it. And the funny thing was we were all chasing this number. And I remember moving from a 470 to a 495 squat before my hip created problems. And I wasn't satisfied with it. I put 25 pounds on my squat. I should have been, right? But because I set this arbitrary line in the sand, based upon no evidence, no data, and just, not that it's bad having numeric goals, but maybe having them over by the end of the year is not realistic. And maybe they should be bolstered by all these process-oriented goals first. So compare that now to today. In 2023, I finally, after 17 years of competing in bodybuilding, I turned pro in the WMBF, the hardest and most competitive natural bodybuilding federation. And not knowing if I ever would achieve that and being really pleasantly surprised that I did, now I've set the goal of trying to place top 5 in worlds. But I've already done nearly 20 years of work to get there. For me, it's like shooting for the stars, and I know I'll be happy if I even reach the moon. But that's not what most people do. They're totally new to fitness, and their trainer goes, right, let's get out this SMART goal worksheet, and you're giving them the opportunity to fail right out of the gates, which when you should be giving the opportunity to stack chips and successes that they can't miss. They're processes, right? There's no question. If they actually do the work is done, and that is the goal. And we know that if that work is done consistently, they'll get the outcome.
Where could personal trainers or fitness coaches do with a little bit more training? Training as in schooling or teaching of themselves. What areas should they generally be looking out to grow their practice?
I'd say behavior change, the most important thing. I know it is super cliche to say, but doing what's optimal on paper is kind of what many people get into personal training for. They love how many ATP are generated from different substrates. They're really interested in periodization. They're fans of bodybuilding. They love the optimization game. These are people who love fitness so much they decided that they wanted to spend their time not doing fitness, right, as a career. And I'm in the same boat. And I was unfortunately naive enough to think that if I just gave people the same information that I had, that they would therefore go, oh, this is amazing. Instead of realizing that the people I'm working with have struggled with fitness so much that they're literally paying me to help them do it. In some cases, they are thinking they can outsource their own motivation. I won't do this on my own. Maybe I can pay you to do it for me. Thinking of it almost like, hey, I don't brush my teeth. What if I just go to the dentist 3 times a week? That's kind of what their mindset is at sometimes. And you know that's not going to be successful, or at least it won't be financially sustainable for many people. So what do? Well, you have to really figure out ways to get them to change their mindset. Behavior change starts up here. It doesn't start in an Excel sheet. It doesn't start in MyFitnessPal. So most trainers need to spend a whole lot more time upskilling on understanding the motives behind their clients and realizing that often the trainers are fundamentally different people than the people they're coaching. So trying to make them little clones of you doesn't work very well. In fact, it's probably going to result in abject failure like it did for me. And once I started doing a better job of relating to the people who came to me and not treating them like bodybuilders who were 21-year-old males, then I started doing better. And the more I leveraged that, and the more I focused on behavior change and helping people, things like motivational interviewing, reflective listening, understanding the science behind human motivation like self-determination theory, and looking at ways of setting people up for success and operating within the constraints of their lives. That is when I actually started to get some success. And instead of shoehorning them into like powerlifting and bodybuilding, like, why don't you try an intramural, like the adult soccer league, right? We just need activity. What do you like? You don't like lifting weights? Fine. That doesn't have to be a personal affront to Eric Helms. That can simply just be, let's find the activity that you do love.
I think this sort of outsourcing motivation point is aligned with where I feel like my fitness journey has gone, not in to say that I don't have the intrinsic motivation to get going, but I understand that the motivation there is so much stronger. And everybody intuitively knows this, that if there's outside accountability, you have some additional stakes to being able to stick with your habits, whatever it is. Do we have any sort of literature that reflects that in a health and fitness context, as far as having a personal trainer, having workout buddies? Do we have anything that reflects that?
We absolutely do. There is strong research to show that, for one, the effort that is put forth acutely in a given workout is higher when you're being supervised. There's even an effect where people can lift heavier loads when they have a spotter, right? So confidence is higher, right? And then on a more meta level, we do have a fair amount of data on social support more broadly. There is, in fact, information that would suggest that the role of social support is beneficial in weight loss. We've actually got, I'm not sure when this podcast episode will drop, but on the 1st of May, our issue comes out, and the good Dr. Eric Trexler is reviewing some research specifically showing that there's a consistently beneficial effect when we look at some of the aggregate data on social support and enhancing weight loss. So absolutely, there is numerous data from physical activity to nutrition adherence to actual outcomes like weight loss or the effort put forth in a given set that indicate that having a personal trainer, a workout partner, just a spotter, or being supervised generally, or being part of a support group, or just simply, like you said, putting your intentions out there in the world for accountability purposes can enhance the outcomes or the likelihood that you'll stick with a given behavior.
What's the relationship between motivation, body dysmorphia, and the tyranny of progress?
Good question. So the tyranny of progress, I actually heard another researcher say on another podcast, and I kind of stole it because I loved it. And one of the things, and this is very common in bodybuilders, competitive or otherwise, is that they get addicted to beating the last PR, right? Beating the logbook. And that's amazing because it's you versus you. You're competing with yourself. There's a lot of positive ways to frame that. And indeed, it does tie in nicely to progressive overload. But I think it can also lead people to focusing on that almost exclusively, to being better than last time, to where phases where that's not realistic for very good reasons can result in someone making decisions they otherwise wouldn't. One thing you will hear in most people who end up turning to performance or aesthetic enhancing drugs is we're still chasing that endorphin high of progress. And there's nothing wrong with chasing progress, don't get me wrong. But I think it is unfortunate when your values shift to simply whatever it takes to progress, because it means that you're probably not viewing other ways of seeing the benefits of training. There is something to be said for just striving against the iron, being process-oriented, not outcome-oriented. And I often talk to my competitors about having a multi-layered cake of motivation. Oftentimes, competitors will start with a focus on winning. They want to win. It's not even an intrinsic focus on beating my prior self. It's I want to beat those other competitors. And sometimes they'll find that they're not actually satisfied in the way they thought they would be, or that their motivation wanes when they're not in a position to be competitive. And bodybuilding is a very rough place if you're focused on those external outcomes, because it not only is a subjective sport, but you don't know who's going to show up. It's not like running that 10-second 100-meter sprint, where you can objectively compare that to the record books, like say powerlifting or other individual sport. It's literally based upon who shows up on the day and what are the judges' interpretations subjectively of these rather ambiguous criteria in some categories, and then how do things shake out for you on the day? The peaking process, the lighting, the color. A lot of things you don't have a lot of control over are going to dictate that outcome. And you could be at your best and place quite poorly in one show and not be that good, but in a weak show, actually win. And that's not a way for you to progress as an athlete, focusing on the external outcome and not learning the lessons of how did you compare to you relative to your potential. So the first step of changing that cake to having multiple layers from just being all about winning is, okay, I do want to beat myself. I want to be the best version of myself. And you'll start to see athletes put up last season's picture on the wall. I want to beat that guy. I'm looking at the man in the mirror, the woman in the mirror. And that's great. It is a objectively better way of viewing things that's going to keep you in the game longer, because for the majority of your life, you will be able to improve. But unfortunately, whether it's due to injury, change in life circumstances, or biological age, you might get to the point where you hit your last PR. You can no longer improve. And you don't want to be the person who gets to the age of 60 when it's even more important to still be lifting weights and decide that I don't have the motivation to do it anymore because I can't be better than myself. And I've seen many lifters retire, and not just from competition, but also from consistent training. And I think that specifically speaks to how their motivation got subverted by a focus on the external. There's a great study by Fishbach and Choi in 2012, where they had people run on the treadmill and either focus on the process of running and what they enjoyed from it, or focusing on the reason why they were running, what they were trying to get to, either an improved VO2 max or weight loss or some outcome that they would not get at the end of that session, but they would get from months and months of running. And then they had those two groups predict how long they thought they would run for, and they had them run as long as they wanted, and they compared the difference. The interesting thing is the people focused on the outcomes underperformed. They predicted they'd run a certain length of time, and they didn't reach it. The people who were process-oriented overperformed. They predicted they'd run for a certain amount of length of time, but they were process-focused, focusing on the things they liked about running, and they actually ran longer than they expected themselves to. And then the final kind of nail on the coffin on this mindset is that the amount of time that was ran by the folks in the process-oriented group was significantly greater than those in the goal-oriented group. And the title of that paper from 2012 is titled, when goal pursuit undermines goal achievement.
Brings a whole new angle to the truism of the man who loves walking will walk further than the man who loves the destination. So
Exactly.
there you go. There's some research to back up the truism now. How do you coach people when you're trying to walk them through this behavior change part, this motivation change part? What are some ways that you get people from point A to point B that you would encourage either myself acting in my own personal best interests or somebody that I'm trying to help through this process?
Well, most importantly for people who are trying to help others, your trainers, your nutritionists, your health coaches, if there is a quote unquote trick or secret to therapy, and therapists will agree with this, I've talked to a few, is that any revelation is only revelatory if it comes from you. You might have some of those light bulb moments when you listen to someone else talk, but the therapist might be thinking, you know what, this is totally related to the abandonment issues you had with your mother. And they can say that to you and you might nod and even agree, but it doesn't mean anything. But when the actual patient can go, oh my God, I think this is related to the abandonment issues I have with my mother, that is much more likely to result in systemic behavior change. Then you can start reconsidering your motivations, identifying them, and making different choices, and quite literally rewiring your neurobiology and your coping strategies. The premise of much of effective therapy is that you're not broken, right? The things you do probably worked really well for you when you were a 6-year-old middle child in an alcoholic family, just trying to survive. However, disappearing in the corner when there's conflict is not serving you super well in your adult relationship or maybe in your high-pressure job. So how do we make a different decision? Well, we have to go all the way back to those formational, possibly traumatic experiences, reframe them, be aware of them, identify when those kind of triggers are tripped and your response to them, and give you some space and the opportunity to bring the adult to the table and make a different decision. So one thing that trainers love, nutritionists love, all the people I talked about, health coaches love, is solving problems. And it almost seems antithetical to our desire, the stated intention of our job, and what our clients are literally asking us to say, look, it's not our job and we can't solve problems for our clients. But it's actually true. But what we can do is help our clients on that journey of self-discovery, ask them why, ask them to ask themselves why and to reflect, provide them a non-judgmental, safe space to do it, and then step into that gap when they do start to have some of these revelations with actionable, useful, evidence-based processes and a stepwise fashion to trying to implement them. And when that inevitably doesn't work, try your second, third, fourth, fifth, and eighth plan, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, on until you find the right fit or right combinations of fit, and encourage them that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and I've got your back the whole way through. So I think understanding things like what is human motivation consist of. SDT, self-determination theory, is a great understanding for everybody who wants to help someone else. If you understand that they need to feel autonomous, you'll understand why that revelation doesn't work for you. You can't have a revelation for someone else. They need to feel like they're in charge of their own destiny. This is my hero's journey. They also need to feel competent. So you don't want to be the person who is always providing the information to your client almost like a crutch. You want to teach them to fish, not just provide them fish every day, so that when they're not within your care, when they go on vacation, when they're going to the gym on their own, when you're on vacation, they know what to do. And they feel like they're gaining expertise in this thing that they felt bad at, so bad they wanted to hire someone else to help them do it. So you're an educator as well. You're a teacher. You're helping them get a version of you that they carry around on their shoulder that helps them not just make better decisions, but also feel competent when they enter the weight room, or they enter a restaurant, or they go to a social event, even though you're not there. So you're not the answer to their problems. You're the teacher that helps them solve their own problems. And then finally, relatedness. You're trying to help them integrate into a new identity, which includes a community. Create a newsletter for your clients, invite them to events, encourage them to join classes and partake in a hiking club or whatever. Get on the bodybuilding.com forums if it's 2005. All of those things are important. So leveraging self-determination theory is really important, and also related theories that seem to be evidence-based and comport with actual data, like the COM-B model of behavior change. And this is an easy one to remember. Competence, opportunity, motivation equals behavior change. COM-B. It's almost like a diagnostic tool trainers can use. Is the person lacking the knowledge to do something well? They don't have the competence. You ask them to go to the gym and lift weights because they want to, they need to build some muscle. They never lifted weights before. Okay, you got to teach them how to do that. You told them these 3 macros, these 3 magic numbers that if they just follow, they'll lose weight. They think nuts are high in protein, not high in fat. They need competence, right? You told them to go on this super fantastic diet, but it's double the expenses of their current income to go on it. Okay, we have an opportunity issue here. How do I find the student budget or the low-income family budget version of this healthy diet? Or the motivation. Now you go back to SDT. All right, well, what aspect of SDT are they missing to be motivated enough to do these things, capitalize on the opportunity, and leverage their competence to get behavior change? So those are where I would start, and those types of understandings from a diagnostic perspective for a trainer are what I would highly recommend people think about and upskill in.
What's the biggest lesson you've learned inside the gym that's been most applicable outside? Or the inverse of that, what's the most important lesson you've learned outside the gym that has been most applicable inside?
Yeah, I would say be present and be in the moment. The last thing you want to be doing when you try to get under a 500-pound squat or a 360-pound bench press, if I'm speaking from personal lifetime bests, is to be thinking about something else. You need to be there, and you quite literally cannot be somewhere else and be successful in that. And this also applies to things that take longer than that. If I'm doing a contest prep and I know that I have 3 months left on the diet, today I feel like trash. I'm hungry. I'm not sleeping well. I'm irritable. It's going to seem like a long 3 months if I'm not present and focused on, hey, this is my reality right now, but I've been through harder. I've survived. Damn it, I'm 41 as of, 3 days ago. I'm going to be okay. I'm a resilient person. So let me just deal with what's in front of me right now. So I think lifting weights is the one of many lessons of just striving against the iron for its own sake. Teaches you about putting forth the requisite effort and being present with the task at hand. And you can supplant that with anything. Cutting sushi, folding origami. I don't know why I'm on, Japanese mindset right now. That's where my head went. Chopping wood, whatever, sweeping the floor. Just be present with what you're doing and realize that commitment starts in the present moment. And then it eventually turns into an identity. So it all does start with just acknowledging that there really is only now.
I have one final question that I like to ask all my guests, and that's, what's the last opinion or belief that you changed your mind about?
I'd say the last one was that it makes sense to try to reduce the effort in a given set to do more volume. That is a more recent change based upon a preprint that was done by Robinson and colleagues that showed a relatively linear relationship between proximity to failure and the stimulus from that given set. Before that, I focused on the data showing that there was a relationship between volume and adaptation, hypertrophy, and to a lesser degree strength. And that led me to relatively reductionist thinking of, okay, so we need to do more things to maximize volume or increase volume. And it should be the primary variable. But that's not really what that relationship even was back then. Those meta-analyses were on people primarily training to failure. So the data we had was like, right, when we train to failure, more work seems to be better. And the meta-analysis we currently see by Robinson and colleagues shows that, yeah, when you're doing a lot of volume, it makes failure a little bit less important. But the relationship still holds true, even when we just look at the broad, data set. So while I'm open to changing my mind again on this, kind of my order of operations now is let's make sure we're within a few reps, 2-3 reps of failure. If the goal is hypertrophy, not necessarily strength or other adaptations. And then given the exercises we're using and making smart choices and the constraints we have and everything else I talked about, from there, let's think about an appropriate dose. Not, I want to get to 20 sets because of some belief I have about an appropriate volume and what I need to do. And right now I'm getting really beat up from 15. So let me go from a 0 to 2 RIR to a 3 to 4 RIR to accommodate it. Because I think what you'd end up doing in most cases is getting a similar outcome, but having to do twice as much work to achieve it. And that impinging upon your time in the gym and just being less efficient, which is going to have knock-on effects in the rest of your life.
I love it, Eric. I love your work. You are not a hard guy to find, but if we want to send people to 2,000 more hours of content, where should they go?
Well, we're actually doing a mass sale right now that is going through to, I think, the 3rd of May. So Mass Research Review is on sale. You lock in a subscription, not just for 1 month, but forever at 30% less than normal. And this is where myself and Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple, who just defended her thesis successfully. Congratulations. As well as Dr. Eric Trexler and Mike Zerdos. We review content. And this is kind of the gritty details of everything we talked about in this podcast. You can find stuff on the CABI model. You can find a review of that meta-regression to failure in mass. And we do that on a monthly basis. We get video content. We have written content. We have audio summaries. And that's one place. If you're interested in actually thinking more about competitive natural bodybuilding, then check out 3dmusclejourney.com. And if you just want to read it all in one place, like, okay, tell me everything about building muscle and strength, I've got a book for that called The Muscle and Strength Pyramids, and for nutrition and training. And for anything else, like me appearing on awesome podcasts like this, I'm probably going to share it on my Instagram at Helms3DMJ.
Perfect. Eric, thanks for joining me. I appreciate you taking the time, and catch you on the next one.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.